It does appear that he is a bit more comfortable in the car than what Checo was, and I do believe he will be a bit closer to everyone else in the top 14 battle, even if he does end up taking the wooden spoon in the end. And personally speaking, I don't believe he will get demoted during the season like some people believe he will. Oh, for f***'s sake. So yeah, after only 2 races, it seems my prediction might be going down the toilet already, so much so that I even decided to dip my hands at shorts because of this. So although it hasn't been announced yet, it has been heavily rumoured that Liam Lawson will be demoted to Racing Bulls from the Japanese Grand Prix, with Yuki Tsunoda, who was already contracted to be the official reserve driver for the team, stepping up to replace him at Red Bull. And yes, I am well aware that Franco Colapinto has been linked with Racing Bulls by Spanish and Argentinian media, but personally, I don't see that happening. That better not come back to bite me in the arse like this one. That being said, it is still a rumour, but with the difficult start to the year Liam has had, I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being true by the time F1 arrives in Japan next weekend. So for this video, I thought I would react to this along with a general overview as to why the second seat at Red Bull has been a curse. This may end up being a short video, it may not, but without any hold ups, let's get into the topic in hand. So for anyone who is unaware or wasn't paying attention to what I was saying in around the first minute of this video, it was reported by many top media publications that Red Bull are doing a serious consideration of swapping Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda around from the Japanese Grand Prix, which takes place next weekend and is Yuki's home race. Now I'm recording this segment on Tuesday, so by the time you see this on Friday, it may have been announced. So, future JW, can you confirm if this has been announced or not? Okay, that's good to know. Regardless of whether he's been announced or not, or whether it will happen for Suzuka or later, one thing that cannot be denied is the poor start to the season that Liam has had, with him struggling to get out of Q1 during qualifying and him being unable to score a point, with him crashing out in Australia after he was way off the pace anyways, and him finishing 15th on the road in China, which later became 12th as a result of Hamilton, Leclerc and Gasly's disqualifications. Yeah, even their DSQs didn't lift him into the points. Ouch. But whilst it has been a poor start, and Liam has undeniably performed worse than what Checo did in the last 2 years, and I think we all owe Checo an apology as a result, the question is though, is it really all on him? No is the obvious answer. Now look, some of the blame does have to go to Liam, because he has underperformed in a car that should be higher up than where he is placing it. But at the same time, the majority of it is down to the car he is driving, because as a lot of people will tell you, Liam is not the first example of this. Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon and Sergio Perez say hi. But why is this the case, and why is it that Max is able to perform in that car but not others? Well, it's a very simple answer. Ever since Daniel Ricciardo left Red Bull at the end of 2018 to effectively kill his Formula 1 career, Max has been the number 1 driver at Red Bull, and with that came a lot of perks that he didn't have when he and Daniel were on equal terms. Most notably, he was able to have more influence in how the car should handle, and with how Max's driving style is, which as Scott Mansell explained, is kind of a hybrid version of Michael Schumacher's driving style, he likes a car that's loose on the rear end, as his driving style allows him to drive around that and get the best out of himself. Hence why he's been an unstoppable force for the last few years, and is why most people, including myself, believe he's the best driver in the world right now. But that being said, this philosophy of designing your car around one driver does come with its drawbacks, as whilst the number 1 driver gets preferential treatment, the second driver will often get neglected and will often have next to no influence in how the car should handle. Now, fair enough, a team having a number 1 and number 2 driver isn't anything new. In fact, when you look at the history of Formula 1, most champions have been number 1 at their respective teams. Lewis Hamilton when he had Valtteri Bottas as his teammate, Sebastian Vettel when he had Mark Webber as his teammate, Fernando Alonso when he had Giancarlo Fisichella as his teammate, and most prolifically, Michael Schumacher when he had Rubens Barrichello as his teammate. However, the difference with those teammates compared to the ones Verstappen has had is that those teammates, although slower than the designated number 1 driver, were able to provide a good supporting role to them, and that was down to the fact that the car was drivable for them to be able to get the best result possible in order to help the team's Constructors' Championship aspirations. Ironically, one of the examples I brought up did involve Red Bull at one point, but nowadays this isn't the case at all. Now, fair enough, when Sergio Perez was brought in to be Max's teammate from 2021, it initially looked like that he was able to provide a good supporting role, as he was able to get the most points possible in order to not only help Max out, but also to help Red Bull's aspirations of winning the Constructors' Championship. And although they would fail to do so in 2021, they would correct that stat in 2022, wrapping it up with 3 races to spare. However, by the time the European phase of the 2023 season came around, the performance gap between Max and Checo began to increase at an alarming rate, similar to how the performance gap between Max and Alex increased when the 2020 season arrived. This increase led to Checo making numerous mistakes and also being way off the pace in qualifying, which ended up hampering his race. Thankfully for Checo, due to the fact that Red Bull had built the most dominant car in F1 history, he was able to disguise this somewhat and would do enough to ensure Red Bull retained their Constructors' crown from 2022. However, when the 2024 season arrived, although Checo would get off to a good start, similar to how he did in 2023, minus the wins of course, by the time McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes caught up to Red Bull, the performance gap between the two drivers was exposed in the worst way possible, with Checo being unable to help his teammate fend off the oncoming attack from the other 3 teams, and this would have an effect on Red Bull's championship aspirations, as although Max was able to retain his crown from 2023 thanks to the strong first half of the season he had, the team couldn't do the same in the Constructors, as by the time the Azerbaijan Grand Prix came to a close, Red Bull would lose the lead in the Constructors to McLaren, which they would maintain for the remainder of the season, with Ferrari also able to overtake Red Bull, demoting the Austrian energy drinks company to 3rd in the Constructors, being lucky to have an enormous gap to Mercedes thanks to them being inconsistent throughout the season. This, as a result, led to Checo being sacked by Red Bull after the season came to a close, with his 2-year extension that he had signed in the middle of the season being terminated via a mutual agreement between both parties. And despite Tsunoda having more experience, on top of the fact that he drove the 2024 Red Bull during the Abu Dhabi test, the team opted to go with Lawson on the basis that they believed he was mentally stronger to drive for the senior team compared to Yuki. That and the fact that he is a Honda driver who are splitting with Red Bull at the end of this year, but obviously they aren't going to mention that for commercial reasons. They made him the reserve driver though, so that's something. However, as seen in the first 2 races, Lawson has struggled to adapt to the Red Bull as well, with his struggles being comparable to that of Gasly's in 2019, although arguably worse. And after 2 races, his future in the team is already in doubt, with rumours about him being swapped with Tsunoda potentially happening sooner rather than later. But even if this does happen, or has happened if it's been announced before Friday, do I believe Tsunoda will get the car to where it should be? Honestly, no. Now look, although I've been an advocate for the hashtag Justice for Yuki movement ever since he got snubbed of that second Red Bull seat, I have to admit that given how much of a handful the Red Bull has been this year in the hands of Liam Lawson, and even in the hands of Max Verstappen, who has literally been dragging that car this year, I can't see how Yuki will do any better, even if he is slightly better than Liam, and this leads to an even wider problem with Red Bull, particularly with their sister team Racing Bulls. Thing is, if Liam does end up getting demoted, there is probably a very high chance that Liam will thrive in that car and be able to turn his season around. Why? because the Racing Bulls car is a much easier car to drive than the Red Bull. Even Max Verstappen has admitted this. Besides, why do you think Gasly was able to do well in the sister team after he was demoted? Thing is, the sister team is supposed to share similar characteristics to the Red Bull but at a slower performance, as the aim of that team is not only to allow up and coming drivers to show off their potential at the top level, but it's also to better prepare themselves for if and when they get the call up to the sister team. But with how difficult the Red Bull is to drive, it isn't setting them up to succeed anymore, but more setting them up to fail. A great analogy I can give for this is what is going on at the moment in the Premier League and the Championship in football. For the last couple of seasons, the wage gap between the Premier League and the Championship has massively grown to an alarming rate, which has meant as a result, teams that get promoted from the Championship don't have a fair chance of staying up in the league and will more often than not end up getting relegated by the end of the season, with it feeling like the promoted teams are only in the Premier League to make up the numbers. Same thing is happening with Red Bull and Racing Bulls, as with how much of a difference the two cars handle, it makes it feel like the driver getting promoted from Racing Bulls is only there to ensure the second seat is filled, rather than that driver trying to carve a legacy of their own. This is also why in recent years, the junior team has ended up having one young driver and one experienced driver instead of two young drivers, as with how difficult the Red Bull is to handle, it doesn't make sense for the team to nurture two young drivers just to set them up to fail, which is why for the last few years, no one has referred to them as a junior team. Now don't get me wrong, I do think Yuki will do slightly better in the Red Bull than what Liam has done, but personally speaking, I don't think it will be by a lot, and I do think like with every other driver before him, he will sadly drown. And if that ends up happening, where does Red Bull go from here? Honestly, and I don't think there's any nicer way of putting this, but I generally think they are f***ed. To me, it doesn't matter who they put in that car. As long as their philosophy of building their car around Max stays the same, nothing will change with that second seat. Even if they put someone like Hamilton, Leclerc, Norris, Piastri, Russell, or even Alonso, someone who is either world class or is very fast, none of them will make a difference either, as at the end of the day, neither of them have the same or even a similar driving style to what Max has, because at the end of the day, Max's driving style is very unique. But the issue of that second seat will eventually lead to an even bigger problem in my opinion, as when the day comes when Max decides to lead the team, I believe Red Bull will be even more f***ed than what they are now, as without their star driver, both cars will end up floundering towards the back rather than just one. And if you believe I'm exaggerating about that, just look at what happened to Repsol Honda in MotoGP when Marc Marquez left the team at the end of 2023, a rider whose riding style the team were basing their bike around. Plus, if you look at this year, I think there are already signs that the team's performance is already dropping off, as along with the decline they had last year, the team appears to be in a worse shape than they were in the second half of last year, as with how much of a handful the Red Bull has been around the corners, it's even led to suggestions, which even I agree with, that their car is a lot worse than we think it actually is, and is only being hidden because of how much of a freak Max Verstappen is. Take for example what happened in qualifying for the Chinese Grand Prix, as in Q3, Max was only able to place his Red Bull in 4th place, being behind both McLarens and the Mercedes of George Russell, who put in an amazing lap to split the two McLarens. But if we look behind, the Racing Bulls of Isaac Hadjar managed to place his car in 7th place, with the gap between himself and Max in 4th being only 2/10, whilst Yuki Tsunoda, who ended up qualifying 9th, would have been 1/10 behind had he not made a mistake on his final lap at the hairpin. With the gap being that close between the two cars, it led people to speculate that if Max was in that car, would he have gone a lot quicker than what he did in the Red Bull?
Things that make you go,
It is a very interesting thought, and I'm curious to find out what you guys think in the comments below. Either way, although I can understand the switch if it does happen, I do feel at the same time it is very harsh on Liam, as I feel they should have given him until at least Jeddah to prove he can turn these results around, given the next 3 races are on tracks that he is familiar with. Although personally speaking, I don't think he would have been able to do so, given how difficult that Red Bull has been to handle. In terms of Yuki, if he does end up being promoted, I hope it does work out for him. But as I've mentioned earlier, regardless of that hashtag, I do fear he'll end up drowning in the same way. But if he doesn't, it will raise questions as to why Red Bull didn't choose him in the first place, even if it would have been for only 1 year due to his connections with Honda. Even though they've said they won't help him with his future after 2025, which is a real shame. Anyways, those are my thoughts about the whole situation. Be sure to leave your opinions below, and until next week, take care.